What's up, everybody? Good morning. Happy Sunday. Doing something a little different today. Let's see. Try shooting outside today. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Maybe good, maybe bad. I don't know. Trying something different here. So we're shooting outside just because we're in Arizona and the weather's beautiful. So if you hear owls, dogs, people barking, people bark too. Don't mind. But I figured we'd try this. And you're probably hearing my waterfall, which I forgot to turn off, which is on a timer. Nevertheless, we're out here on my patio, upper deck, just hanging out, shooting another coffee and conversations, and hopefully having a fun and interesting discussion this morning on something extremely interesting, particularly with my line of work. Before we get to that, let's talk about what's in the cup. I don't know about you guys, but I love Colombian coffee, real Colombian stuff. And from one of my favorite local brewers here, got some Colombian single origin, very sweet, light roast, has a chocolatey undertone, really a great cup of coffee. And I drink this one black, even though I don't really like sweet coffee, but at the same time I don't like bitter coffee. I don't think coffee is supposed to be bitter. It's actually supposed to be sweet. It comes from the seed, comes from the bean, and most of the coffee that we drink out there from commercial roasters is just rancid, which is why you need to add so much sugar to it in order to enjoy it. It's not the way it was intended to be enjoyed. So I'm enjoying this black cup, and it's how I'm starting my day. Curious to hear what you guys are drinking. If you want to drop it in the comments. Just so smooth, no sugar, no cream, nothing, sweet, very, very nice. So we've pinned the topic for today, and the topic for today is Dominion's defamation lawsuit against Fox News. And let me just start by saying this is not a political discussion. This topic supersedes the question of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or whatever. And there's no intended political spin here at all. Hey, how you doing? Thanks for joining. But it is extremely, extremely interesting from the standpoint of defamation. Defamation against a private corporation by some extremely well-known bigwig news company executives and the news company itself and their counsel, etc. Let's jump right into it. So Dominion is a private company that actually manufactures the voting systems that are used here in the United States. They are used in over 1,300 jurisdictions in the United States. So not a small company. As you can imagine, with voting, the integrity and security of the voting system is extremely, extremely important, right? That would be like having a COVID test that is unsubstantiated or has zero efficacy or zero accuracy. So voting systems, voting, the essential fabric of our country, right? Pretty important. I would argue one of the most important things in the United States of America is the integrity of our democracy, which is premised on electing officials, publicly electing public officials through proper means and through really sacred machines that have to operate accurately and that have to convey results in an accurate, non-biased, what you put in is what comes out manner. So Dominion filed recently a defamation lawsuit against Fox News and several of its executives. So those executives include Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Maria Bartiromo, and the basis for their lawsuit, it is a $1.6 billion lawsuit, meaning that's how much they're alleging in claims. In this case, it's for lost profits. But the basis of their lawsuit is that Fox News purported as fact the allegation, false allegation, that they rigged their systems, that they rigged the machines, that they injected votes for Joe Biden and completely tanked the integrity of the democratic process in the United States of America. Pretty significant claims. As a result of these accusations, unless you live under a rock, you saw what has happened the last few months, probably 6 months now, in the United States of America, with riots, protests, people, American people, people all over the world really saying, was your voting system compromised? Was the integrity of the electoral process compromised? And Dominion, of course, says this is 100% fictitious folklore, made-up stuff. And what's even more interesting is now that we discover, when things get litigated, that even the attorney that represented former President Donald Trump is recanting her statements. And we're going to get to that in a second. But the bottom line is, today's discussion is about the Dominion defamation lawsuit against Fox News. They're seeking $1.6 billion in lost profits. And they're also seeking, interestingly enough, $1 million in their security costs, because according to them, many of the Dominion employees received death threats, and they had to significantly ramp up security to protect their people, protect themselves. And I think you saw this, unless you live under a rock, happening in all over the place in the United States of America, where people were actually harassing and attacking people who worked at voter stations, people unaffiliated with Dominion. Maybe they were volunteers. At any rate, the dominoes that fall in this case are unbelievable, and they're a great learning lesson for anybody who's interested in defamation or just what this case is about. But the crux of the claims, again, like you heard, was that Dominion rigged the election. Rigged the election. Not that the systems were inaccurate, but that they rigged the election, that there was massive voter fraud. They literally alleged, they meaning executives on Fox News, that votes were injected. The particular show that these statements were very, very popular on was the Lou Dobbs show. And interestingly enough, after Dominion filed its defamation lawsuit, Smartmatic, another voting machine manufacturer, filed a separate lawsuit seeking $2.7 billion against Fox. So this is not something that is unique to Dominion. There were many allegations specific to Dominion, but also to Smartmatic and other election systems and volunteers, people who were counting votes, that they were rigging this election. We know that as a result of these allegations, there were riots. You remember the Capitol riots. You remember that there are people being prosecuted from this. There were people who brought weapons to the Capitol. And this was not something that was taken lightly. The allegation of fraud was not taken lightly. And remember, there were multiple lawsuits filed across the country by former President Trump's administration, accusing, essentially seeking a re-election or a recount on the premise of voter fraud. Right? So that's kind of the landscape that this is happening in. I don't think anyone could say that the allegation of voter fraud is a mild allegation, meaning that it's no big deal, didn't really mean it, or whatever. The interesting thing is, so that the complaint in the Dominion case basically says that with reckless disregard for the truth, we'll talk about why that statement's important. Reckless disregard for the truth, Fox News and its executives published this statement. And in some cases, they knew that these allegations were false. Not that they didn't perform enough diligence or didn't have the facts, that they knew this was intentional. And we're going to talk about why that's extremely important as it relates to Trump's former counsel, Sidney Powell, in just a second. But there were hashtags being made off this, right? Stop the steal. Many of you remember this. Maybe some of you participated in it. Again, this is an apolitical conversation. It's not geared towards Democrats or Republicans. But the point is, the allegations of fraud were made. People in the United States took it very seriously. People campaigned, they rioted. There were lawsuits filed against states. There were lawsuits filed to stop and do a recount. Very, very, very significant trauma flowing from the allegation of voter fraud or fraudulent machines or rigging the election that were directed at Dominion specifically, and this other company that we talked about called Smartmatic. Why is this significant? I'll tell you why it's significant. Number one, an allegation of fraud against anybody, particularly a private company, a private actor, in this case a corporation, Dominion, is what we call defamation per se. You're questioning the competency of the system, of a person, of a company. You are also accusing them of a crime. Rigging an election is a crime. And you're accusing them of fraud. In most jurisdictions, it's defamation per se, meaning we don't have to prove our damages. It's enough for us to go to a jury and say, jury, you determine the damages. I can establish a prima facie case that I was injured because of the nature of the allegations. And there are several other categories of statements that fall into that bucket of defamation per se. One of them is accusing a woman of being unchaste, or accusing somebody of having a loathsome disease, accusing somebody of engaging in a crime, or accusing a professional of professional incompetence, accusing them of malpractice, for example, improperly. And we have at least two that qualify here, two specifically, which is the fraud, essentially a crime in the context of an election, an incompetence by the company, either essentially intentional fraud, right, which is an intentional tort, conduct aimed at destroying our election. It's a huge, huge allegation to make. And Dominion's extremely upset. I mean, there were statements saying that, and I've read these statements, it's not speculation, that specifically Dominion was created by, was a company that was, urged to have been manufactured or created by Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan leader who essentially is a communist. And it's very, very interesting. Do the research. We won't talk about every single allegation that is lodged against Dominion in terms of the defamation, but it's out there. You can read it. You can actually find the complaint. It's public record. Here's why this is really, really interesting, and why this is not just any other defamation lawsuit. Sidney Powell, I mentioned her earlier, who's counsel for Donald Trump, former counsel for Donald Trump. Remember, Donald Trump filed, dozens of lawsuits. I don't know exactly how many. Maybe somebody watching does. Filed dozens of lawsuits against states contesting the election, accusing the election of being a massive fraud. You remember that? Okay. The attorney was Sidney Powell. She, attorneys represent their clients. We have a duty to research the claims, not simply rely on the statements of our clients. But you had Sidney Powell, who not just filed the documents and made these representations, but she also went on national television. She also was in press conferences saying that this is, stop the steal, that this is a massive voter fraud, that this is a gigantic problem, that she specifically said she had evidence of fraud. This is key. She specifically said she had evidence of fraud, that Dominion was defrauding the American people. That's why this lawsuit, these dozens of lawsuits, should proceed, and not a single one did ultimately. But these are her statements, not the statements of her client. Now she admits, because she's also being sued for defamation. Okay, so not only did Dominion sue Fox, remember we talked about executives at Fox that were sued, but also other individuals. She's also being sued for defamation. In her defense, she admits, this is just recently, that no reasonable person would believe her statements as being fact. Let me say that again. She is admitting, the attorney is admitting, that no reasonable person would believe that the statements she made, i.e. that Dominion engaged in this massive fraud, that they rigged the election, that nobody would believe that her statement was purporting a fact. That's her statement. Why is that a gigantic bomb in this entire defamation case? Here's why. It undermines her prior lawsuit. It undermines her. Essentially, she's admitting that she was a liar. That's the way we're looking at this from a legal analysis standpoint. If you take the position that, look, I'm filing a lawsuit, I have evidence of fraud, then you're sued for defamation and you come back and say, well, nobody thought I was telling the truth. Do you not see the problem with that? I don't think you need to be educated in the law or know anything about defamation to know that if you make an allegation and you say you have evidence of it, not just an allegation, we have evidence that there is fraud. We have evidence of fraud, we have to unwind this election, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you come back and say, well, hey guys, I was just kidding. No reasonable person would have believed that. No reasonable person would have believed that that was a fact that I was purporting. People would think that's hyperbole, right guys? Wrong. Did you not remember that there were people rioting at the Capitol with weapons, broke into the Capitol building? Do you not recall that there was, I don't know how many hashtags, I don't know how many people, both perhaps Democrats and Republicans, who for a second believed that the election was rigged, or if not, still believe that. This was an entire campaign. And now you're coming back and saying, well, nobody would have believed that this was a factual statement. Why is that important in a defamation lawsuit? Because in a defamation lawsuit, for the most part, opinions are not actionable, right? You have to purport a statement of fact. And the standard for that is whether a reasonable person would observe your statement as being factual. That's the test. Hey, Eric, thanks for joining. That's the test. Let me repeat that. The standard for determining whether one of the elements of defamation is met is whether somebody is purporting a fact, a statement of fact, and not an opinion. Statement of facts, the standard, again, in most jurisdictions, is whether it is capable of being proven or disproven. Hyperbole, puffery, statements of gross exaggeration that are intended in the right context to be something that's not believable. People say these things all the time. This is, taking it out of the election context. If somebody would say, well, this is the biggest steal of the century, can I be sued for defamation? Depends on the context. Would anybody believe that what I was saying at the time actually meant theft? That's kind of the defense here. And absolutely, unquestionably, Fox News and multiple executives at Fox purported this as a fact backed with evidence. This was not puffing. This was not saying we think there's, this is the great steal, guys. This is absolutely an allegation of fraud. Absolutely alleging that there's evidence. Now you are faced with a defamation lawsuit. And Sidney Powell, I can't emphasize this enough, counsel is saying no reasonable person would have believed that my statements were factual, Your Honor. And that puts her in hot water as a lawyer, because as a lawyer, you cannot knowingly make false statements to a court. And that's what she did. She just admitted to that. So there's a lawsuit against her in Michigan, in district court, where counsel is seeking sanctions against Sidney Powell for these statements, for filing a lawsuit that she knew was baseless out the gate, that she didn't have evidence. She purported she had evidence. She didn't have evidence. And now she's saying, after the fact, that nobody needed to believe me because I wasn't really speaking a fact, but you sued for fraud. So you didn't believe yourself? Makes zero sense. Bad lawyering at its finest here, in my opinion. The conclusion is, she knew all along that what she was saying was a false statement of fact. And she made it intentionally. Think about that. She made it intentionally. So there's all kinds of issues going on here. It's an interesting web. I'm looking forward to seeing how, this case proceeds. The judge in the Dominion versus Fox case hasn't ruled whether this case can proceed yet, because as most defamation cases go, typically in jurisdictions where there's an anti-SLAPP or even in jurisdictions where there's not an anti-SLAPP, defenses are made as to opinion speech or it's protected First Amendment speech, and a judge has to decide whether the case gets thrown out before it moves to discovery or whether the parties can proceed. In this case, it's even more interesting because, again, in order to dodge the defamation case and the damages and get out from underneath it, Sidney Powell's playbook is, I was not purporting a fact. Who would have believed that I was saying a fact? This is exaggeration. Really? When you filed lawsuits saying that this was fraud and you had evidence of it? Of course it's not hyperbole. You screwed up. Just admit it. You screwed up, but you can't admit it because you're being sued for defamation to the tune of $1.6 billion in lost profits and $1 million in security costs. So not something that you can easily walk away from, right? I also think it's extremely, extremely important that this lawsuit gets resolved, that it not get settled. I think it's an important lesson, whether you are, used to representing plaintiffs or whether you're used to representing defendants, whether you're a news station, that truth is important, and you can't make claims purporting them to be fact and saying you have evidence when in fact you know that's not the case. It's different if you didn't know, right? So defamation is a negligence standard. In this case, we have intentional or reckless disregard for the truth. And an interesting thing about this anecdotally is if you're suing a news station or a broadcaster, typically you cannot sue them on plain negligence, meaning you have to prove actual malice. And that is the law in, I think, every jurisdiction in the United States, because newsworthiness and reporters get this defense. Newsworthy content gets a defense because the news, the way it works is it's breaking. You hear something, you report it. There's not a ton of time to find every granule of truth, right? And so when you sue a news reporter or a news agency, you have to show reckless disregard. You have to show or intentional conduct. You have to meet the bar of malice, which is this high, compared to negligence, which is down here. In this case, Fox is being sued on the allegation that they knew, that they absolutely knew that this was false. They later, again, I can't emphasize this enough, Sidney Powell, former President Trump's own lawyer who filed the lawsuits in multiple states alleging fraud, is now saying that no reasonable person would have believed that that was truthful. And by the way, anecdotally, the reason why I think Fox is making this defense and hanging their hat on this defense as well is because you remember, I think it was last year or the year before that, but relatively recently, Tucker Carlson was sued for defamation by a woman who claimed to have had an affair with Donald Trump, who was paid $150,000. I think Karen Doherty was her name. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And she was paid $150,000 not to publish her story. Tucker Carlson made a comment about this being, a falsified story, that this never happened, and she's full of it. And when she sued for defamation, a judge actually dismissed her case on this exact argument, that no reasonable person would have believed that the statements Tucker Carlson made were purporting a fact. But there's a very, very big difference here. I personally don't watch Tucker Carlson, maybe you do, but from the videos that I've seen preparing for this, I've seen that a lot of what he says, some of what he says perhaps, is puffery, is hyperbole. Like I said, somebody may make this statement, perhaps not even in the context of, an election, maybe in the context of a sporting event. Oh, that was a steal. They're not actually saying that, that football team stole the championship or that UFC fighter stole the belt. So query whether Tucker Carlson's defense, which was made successfully, applies equally here. Absolutely it doesn't, because you don't have Tucker Carlson coming back and saying, well, I purported this as a fact with evidence and I have proof, and then coming back later and saying, well, I didn't really actually mean that as a fact. But that's what's happening to the defendants in the Dominion lawsuit. It'll also be interesting to see what happens with Smartmatic's, another election counting machine, I don't know, whatever you call it, election machine company, who is suing Fox as well for $2.7 billion. So this has a long way to go. I personally don't think that there will be a settlement. I don't think Dominion has an interest in just covering some costs that they lost here. Again, they supply to 1,300 jurisdictions, not a small company, for perhaps the most important democratic process, voting. And so it's not small beans. And I guess we'll see how this shakes out. But curious to hear what you think. Drop your comments in. If you have questions, you're welcome to send us a direct message. We'll try to answer them. But in the world of defamation, this is a case that's definitely on our radar. We're watching it carefully. And yeah, I don't know. I think the defense is uphill here, just based on the representations that were made about having evidence, that we've seen it, that there were votes injected. Again, those statements formed the premise for multiple lawsuits, not even one, that were pushed really, really hard, that we're going to prove that this was fraud. Now there's all this backpedaling, and I don't think the backpedaling is going to work too well. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation. Again, a beautiful morning in Arizona, hence the different venue. Let me know what you think of the venue. If you think it's bad, if you think it's good, you like it better in my office, I don't know. But looking forward to hearing what you guys think. Until next time.